this is really a fanboy moment. I'm a great admirer of Mahmood Mamdani and all that he's written, and I don't know whether anybody in the audience is engaged with some of his books. But if you do pick up any one of his books, each line will be a truth that you need to analyze and look at and revisit. And in many ways, the morning session, which was the session that Gopal Gandhi did on Mahatma Gandhi, sort of resonates in some ways as well. So this particular book, Neither Native Nor Settler, or Neither Settler Nor Native, whichever way it is really, it's every line needs to be unpacked. So I don't think we'll get through too much, but I'm going to start by thanking Mahmood for being here today. It's been 2 or 3 years we've been trying to get Mahmood out to the Jaipur Literature Festival, JLF in Maldives, etc. Mahmood, can I start by asking you to sort of talk about the co-birth of nationalism and colonialism that you talk about in your book, and also the issue of the nation building that you explore in the context of the ethnic cleansing all the way back from the Castilian monarchy and the way that they drove the Jews and the Muslims out, and thereafter what happened.
Thank you. This is quite a glare, which means I can't see you. But I guess it's there for you to be able to see us. Thank you
for the cameras which are making this live.
Thank you for inviting me. Although I received a number of emails asking me not to come here. And I responded to each of them that I have spent my scholarly career dedicated to opening up platforms, creating ground for debate and discussion. And unless a platform is monopolized by somebody or some organization which tries to use it to keep out others, I'm not going to join in advocacy to close that platform. So I'm here, and it doesn't mean that I'm in support of any particular point of view that has been advocated on this platform. So, to the book.
Thank you for that, Mahmood. Just to place on record our appreciation for standing and being here today. Thank you.
So my motivation in writing this book is to reflect on extreme violence. Violence which takes on genocidal proportions. Sometimes a genocide, other times massacres. Violence which cannot be understood as a standalone event. Violence which reproduces itself in cycles of violence. My motivation also comes out of a disaffection with the kind of analysis that followed the Holocaust, and which is identified with Nuremberg. Nuremberg, as many of you may know, was identified with, it is supposed to have made a sharp break by pinning the responsibility for violence on individuals. The fact that you are a state official cannot absolve you of responsibility. You are individually responsible. That model has been institutionalized in the International Criminal Court, which holds individuals accountable for large-scale violence. I became disaffected with this particular approach. I became disaffected with the Human Rights Watch approach, which goes hand in hand with this. If you look at a Human Rights Watch publication, basically its central focus is not on the context of violence, not on the issues that drive the violence, but it's on identifying perpetrators, naming and shaming them. And I ask myself, did Nuremberg succeed? Nuremberg went on to create hundreds and thousands of courts patterned after the Nuremberg court. It then went on to try them. Eisenhower realized that it would take more than 50 years to try all of them. So they kept on thinning the numbers. What Nuremberg never did was to ask, what was the Nazi political project? It never identified the Nazi political project, and it thus never dealt with it. And from that point of view, it failed. It failed because the Nazi political project was shared by the Allies. And that political project was to turn Germany into a pure nation rid of its minorities. When the Allies defeated the Nazis and went into Eastern Europe, they began to create pure nations, to ethnically cleanse Eastern Europe of Germans, move them back into Germany. One crime doesn't wipe out another. So I became interested in this project, the nation-state project. I began to look at its history. Usually, if you go to university courses on the nation-state, they will identify its beginning with the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe, 1648. But I realized that the Treaty of Westphalia was simply the beginning of a particular form of the nation-state, the liberal nation-state. But the illiberal nation-state had begun in 1492. In 1492, in the Iberian Peninsula, a mobilization behind the banner, one religion, one territory, one people, creates a nation state, a Christian nation state, decides to cleanse it of all religious minorities, Jews and Muslims in particular, and at the same time launches a colonization experiment, the discovery of the Americas. I argue that nationalism and colonialism are not two different things. We normally think of two kinds of nationalisms, good nationalism and bad nationalism. Good nationalism brought us together, and bad nationalism targeted others, minorities. The important thing is to realize is that these two things happen at the same time. They are two sides of the same coin. So the book goes on to then trace the effects of the Castilian state building. Initially, cleansing of the minorities, then religious wars throughout Europe, Catholics against Protestants, what we call in history 100 Years' War. Treaty of Westphalia brings those to an end. 20 years later, John Locke writes his On Tolerance to theorize the Treaty of Westphalia, and Locke's explanation is this. Catholics and Protestants must learn to tolerate one another. What does tolerance mean? Tolerance means, he's writing in England, Protestants are the majority. Protestants have sovereignty, and Catholics should accept this. In return, Protestants should tolerate Catholics, meaning let them exercise their beliefs. But Catholics should refrain from supporting any other power politically, including the Pope. So tolerance, minorities within a nation state. What does it mean to have minority rights, but not to participate in sovereignty? It means that democracy is meaningless because the majority is not the result of a democratic deliberation. The majority precedes democracy. An understanding of whose nation state it is not the result of a democratic discussion. It defines democracy. Everywhere, right? Everywhere where the nation state model takes hold. We sometimes tend to just focus on particular places. And in the process, we lose the generality of the problem. I'll stop there. You know, I'm a professor, so we're given 1 hour.
Mahmood, one of the things that you argue, you show us that what Nazi Germany set out to do, the Allies actually did by creating Israel as a state and removing all the Jews to Israel. But you also say that the Allies refused to acknowledge the fact that the very ideology and the political thought behind Nazism rested also in the United States, which practiced ethnic cleansing. 7 million of the native or the First Nation people that they killed.
Let me take the two questions separately. I'll begin with the US. In my view, America is the genesis of what we call settler colonialism. And the American model was exported all around the world. In America, you have two kinds of minorities that have run the course of the history of the modern American state. The American Indian and the African American. Each has a different significance for our contemporary era. The American Indians were the people on that land when the settlers conquered it. First, they tried to eliminate as many Indians as possible. This was the first recorded genocide in modern history. Then, with the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln generalized the solution of reservations. They herded American Indians into separate territories. For the Nazis, this was the inspiration. Hitler realized two things. One, that genocide was doable. It is possible to do genocide. That's what Hitler realized. Second thing Hitler realized is that you don't have to have a common citizenship. You can differentiate between people. The Nuremberg laws were patterned after American laws. Anyway, the US put Indians in reservations. The US invented the model, what we call today the two-state solution. The American state, and alongside it, several protectorates, with degrees of autonomy, but no independence. It has had its own effect, and we will realize the effect if we contrast it with what happened to the African Americans. Because the African Americans were not put in a separate state. The African Americans were part of the one-state solution. They were oppressed terribly within a single state. But the thing is that the American Indians, by being put in separate states, were perpetually fragmented, isolated, up to today. The African Americans, horribly oppressed, but had the possibility of building alliances with other oppressed peoples. So we have a history of the same hundreds of years which have brought us to the point where we are with Black Lives Matter, which are at the forefront of progressive struggles in the US, while the American Indians remain isolated and fragmented. The two-state solution was taken around the world. The latest place is Israel, of course. You had a second question about Nazi Germany. Nazis lost. It is interesting that the Germans did not reverse the Nazi political program, the program to rid Germany of Jews. Instead of rethinking the German state and rethinking Jews as a minority, instead of inviting Jews back into German life, not individuals, but the Jewish people, they arrived at what I would call a neo-Nazi solution, which is to put their resources in creating a separate state for the Jews. No Jews in Europe, few here and there. Jews in Israel. A two-state solution. A separate state for Jews. And those same people of Zionist conviction created a two-state solution inside historic Palestine.
And much of this has the underpinnings of the fact that the uncivilized were not part of the sovereign process. And in America especially, where you see the native or the First Nation people, and similarly in parts of South America and of course in Africa, you looked at the people who were civilized, and they in turn could rule over those who were not civilized, and they lost their sovereign position in that land.
Well, I mean, eventually you begin to ask yourself, what do they mean by civilized? Politically, they meant by civilized those who had arrived at a nation-state solution. Now, from the point of view that I am articulating here, that is barbarism. The nation-state is what prevents us from living together. I'll give you an example. In 1994, when South Africa became, I say, independent, apartheid ended. Political apartheid, legal apartheid ended. There was an election. In that election, the big question was, who should be allowed to vote? There were 2 points of views. One view said, citizens of South Africa. The other said, no, all residents. Because here was South Africa with hundreds of thousands, even over 1 million, migrant labor from the entire region. They had been there for generations. Should they be allowed to vote or not? This migrant labor had been central to the trade union movement. FOSATU in the 70s, COSATU, 80s, 90s. They were politically strong. They succeeded. 94 election, any resident of South Africa was allowed to vote. That's a revolutionary alternative to citizenship, because citizenship is increasingly something that excludes. Citizenship came into being in the French Revolution as a way of including common people, ordinary people, into the political pact. Now it's becoming a way of excluding. I'll come back to this, but so if you have a Jewish nation state, then you have to decide who is a Jew. Who decides who is a Jew in Israel? The Israeli state decides who is a Jew by law. They have two definitions of who is a Jew in Israel. One is in the halakha, the personal religious law. It's a different definition. The other is in the law of return. You created India and Pakistan. Pakistan, a land for Muslims. Who is a Muslim? Look at the history of Pakistan. Running through it. Who is a Muslim? Is Shia a Muslim? Is Ahmadiyya a Muslim? Round the corner, you're going to have the question, who is a Hindu? Right? Who is a true Hindu? And who decides? The state will decide. You will not decide whether you're a Hindu or not. No. The state will decide who is a Hindu. Back to South Africa. This revolutionary notion of resident versus citizen led to 1994 South African independence. Chief Gatsha Buthelezi, I don't know how much you know about South Africa, but one of the Bantustan leaders becomes Home Minister and uses all his resources, his power, to tell his people that if you're dissatisfied and you're not getting jobs and you're not getting enough to eat, it is because all these migrants are here. And they are taking away what is rightfully yours. Just a year or so after 1994 begins violence against migrants. What they call xenophobic violence in South Africa. There's no point in identifying perpetrators. You have to identify the issues. I mean, tell me today, Israel, Palestine, what good would it serve to make a list of perpetrators and take them to court without addressing the question of who belongs, who has rights? The dead are dead. Let's give the living a second chance.
One of the things that you've written about is, unlike the Nuremberg trials, which identified the perpetrator and held them to justice, in South Africa you looked at it differently. You had the Truth Commission. You didn't necessarily look at this person was at fault or that person was at fault. You looked at the entire political climate. Did that succeed? And do you feel that, and you've argued about that, do you feel that is a possible way forward, even though in South Africa it didn't quite work in the way that everybody was hoping that it worked?
I'm not very fond of the Truth Commission. I'll tell you why. The Truth Commission was like a Nuremberg. Crime and punishment. Admit the crime, you will not be punished. That was the Truth Commission. Okay. The Truth Commission did not achieve the change in South Africa. It came after the change. The change in South Africa came with the all-party negotiations. And what was new about the negotiations was that it overturned the human rights presumption. The human rights presumption is that once you have identified a perpetrator, the perpetrator is denied their political rights. Here it was the opposite. We have to build a new South Africa for survivors. not just victims. Victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders, everybody. If we don't, we will have 2 states, or 3 states, or 4 states. So perpetrators were guaranteed their political rights. Right? A new polity was created with the idea. Let me break that for a minute. South Africa really began to change in the 1970s. Before the 70s, the time of Gandhi, the time of ANC, the time of Colored People's Congress, the apartheid logic held. Gandhi's Indian National Congress mobilized only Indians. ANC mobilized only what were called Africans. Colored People's Congress mobilized only colored people. It's only in the 1970s that this notion was challenged by Steve Biko and black consciousness. Biko said, black is not a color, black is an experience. If you're oppressed, you're black. It's a very different idea, very different idea. So you begin to get, beginning the 1970s, not just resistance to apartheid, you get the imagination of an alternative. It's very different. It's not about turning the world upside down. It's about creating a different world. That's the real challenge, right? If we just limit ourselves to resistance, well, so where do we point to? Not this, but what? Right? That's the new thing about South Africa. They did not want to create a state of the majority. They wanted to create a state of all the people. They didn't oppose whites, they opposed white power. Okay, a particular form of power which says it is at the service of a particular section of the population. I look to South Africa as it hasn't been, I won't say it has been successful. No, we all know it's got huge problems. But it pointed in a different direction. Sometimes things can begin in one place and they don't come to fruition in the same place. It can happen somewhere else.
Do you see the Black Lives Matter movement here, sort of in one sense, a takeoff from what Steve Biko started talking about, the lived experience of the black community here, as well as the Dalit community in India?
So look, here's the interesting thing. African Americans are roughly 15% of the population. It's not about numbers. It really isn't. It is about the way. Who can show a way which makes sense to others? Others can put themselves in that position and say, hey, I could live with this. So that this 15% does not appear as a threat. The whole point of white supremacy was to portray this 15% as a threat. Right? So it is that, of course, the Dalit population, the Muslim population, I don't know, the women population is a majority, but is it together? I don't know. But these are all political minorities, right? Well, I'm not in the business of predicting. We always come after things have happened.
Mahmood, going back to Israel, or staying with Israel for a second, Israel was created, the Ashkenazi Jews sort of became the powerhouse there, and there was discrimination even within the state of Israel, even if you leave Palestine out for a second. The Arab Jew, for example, was and continues to be looked at, as well as the Jews from, say, Iraq and say, India and other places. How does that play out in your notion of the sovereignty of that nation state and the purity of that race?
Well, it's a great example because the Ashkenazi, which is the really Eastern European Jews, had a notion of Judaism which was completely Eurocentric. They looked at the Mizrahim, which are the Oriental Jews, who are the majority of Jews today in Israel. They looked at them as uncivilized, barbaric, especially since their mother tongue was Arabic. The only thing they had in common was religion, not language. And they created...
Or culture. They didn't have culture or either as a similar... The Iraqi Jew was very different from the Ashkenazi Jew.
And if language is the carrier of culture, they didn't. So they put in process a civilizing mission to civilize the Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are the people in the occupied territories. They are the people in the Israeli intelligence services, media, etc. They speak Arabic fluently. They're not as light as the Ashkenazi. You take them in an Arabic population, most people will think they're Arabs. You see these TV shows coming out of Israel, and you will see, I can't remember the name of the show, it's become very popular, but yeah, Fauda. These guys are there. These are all Oriental Jews, right? All of them. So they have been through a rough experience. You read Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, writing on the trial, has pages describing these Oriental Jews, about how she felt that she was in the Ottoman Empire or somewhere. That if these guys are our future, we have no future. Okay. Hannah Arendt is supposed to be the model of Ashkenazi Judaism. So if you probe the nation-state project, and which is what I was trying to tell earlier, it's not just minority against majority. It's a minority against the majority, in the majority, and the... I mean, when I think of partition, for example, I think the first partition had three victims, I think. First victim were the Muslims inside what remained as India, because they now were homeless people. Second victim were the Muslims in Pakistan. And the third victim were the Hindus in India. Now we're coming to that. Okay. It's you can see it unraveling, kind of. But I would like to say one more thing, which is that, look, for some reason, this disease is not just confined to India, right? Go to China, Xinjiang. Go to the old Burma, the Muslims. Go to Sri Lanka, Sinhalese. Go to Iran, Shia Islam. Go to Pakistan, Sunni Islam. Go to Afghanistan. Go to India. This whole area, in some places, it has gone much further than in other places, but you can see the trend. So I think it requires a deeper thinking. I'm not, I'm from Uganda, I'm not from India. my grandparents came from India. My wife's family is Indian. But I don't know, I don't have that lived experience, nor the historical grasp as deeply as I would like to have, as I do of the African situation. But somebody needs to study this phenomenon.
I'm going to come back to the unraveling, but perhaps to put all of this in context, do you want to tell us about the difference between the settler, as we've seen in the Americas, and the colonizers, as we've seen, say, in India? And what is the difference when a settler comes in and when a colonizer comes in?
Well, look, you can have settler colonialism without settlers. The settlers in America created 3 institutions, all around 3 different fictions. One was that every native has a homeland. And this was a fiction designed to take away most of the land and herd them into a small territory. Tribal homeland. Second, in every tribal homeland, there is a tribal authority. And that authority is not popularly elected. It has always been there. Third, every tribal homeland, the tribal authority rules the homeland through customary laws. And customary laws are not, they do not require popular consent, but they've also been there historically. So it's total lack of accountability. These things were exported. They were exported to India. Look at the tribal areas in India and Pakistan, how these are. They were exported to Africa. They were exported to South Africa. In the non-tribal areas in India, you had something they called customary law. Hindu customary law, Muslim customary law, etc.
Muslim family law.
No. Look, call it customary law, call it personal law, call it... but all of it was pegged on custom, tradition. Okay? So I want to talk about custom. Custom was, of course, there before the colonizer arrived. But custom is not the same thing as customary law. Custom was part of society. Custom gave society, it was a social resource to deal with internal tensions, disputes, everything. What the colonizer did was wrench custom from society and make it part of state law. Society was weakened. It lost its capacity to self-determine. The state became the determining power. Right? But we defend it as custom. Instead of seeing the difference, what happened to custom? Which would allow us to draw on historical custom to make something new in the future. We have to look at the past as a resource. I mean, we have to look at the past as something which is available for the future also, not to be recycled. in an unimaginative way, in a demagogic way, no. But it's our past. We came out of it.
Coming back a full circle, Neha's given us a wrap-up. This breakdown of customs, as we've seen perhaps in Africa, is that one of the reasons we are seeing this extreme violence that we've seen in Ethiopia, we've seen in Rwanda, or we see continuously happening in some parts of Africa? Is this breakdown of the customary law in the way that customs dictated and the very essence of power as it flowed, as opposed to what it is right now?
The breakdown is around the question of who belongs and who doesn't. Who is a citizen and who is a guest, even if a permanent guest. Who is sovereign and who can ask for no more than individual rights. That's what the breakdown is about. It's those who are excluded who then, because they have nowhere to go. It's not as if they have a home they can go to. They don't have a home. It's the home from which they're being excluded. So they come back with everything at their disposal, including violence.
You know, like as I said, the work that Mahmood Mamdani has done is absolutely seminal, and you can continue to probe deeper and deeper. My request to people who are interested in the ideas behind human rights that we're hearing much more about, tolerance as opposed to empathy, would be really to pick up some of the work that he's done and read it. But we'll just open up for questions. If there are any questions, you need to come down to where the mic is and ask the question so that we can capture it on camera. And if there isn't, that's okay. But anybody for a question? Suhail.
Thank you for an absolutely brilliant session. Quick question. Over the last 15, 20 years, we've seen a resurgence of identity, national identity. We've seen it here, we've seen it across the subcontinent, you're seeing it in Africa, whether it's the white supremacist, whether it is Black Lives Matter, we are seeing it in Germany with the whole neo-Nazi resurgence. My concern is how important for identity's continuous resurgence is economic upheaval. And are the economics of that particular society or country linked to, because you alluded to what happened in South Africa about, the thing against migrants. Do you see a linkage in all the work that you've done between economic compulsions and the continuous going back to national identity or community identity or whatever it is?
Sure, economic issues are important, very important. Economic crisis can exacerbate your living situation and can force you to go back to whoever you think you are, now in a group sense, what you're calling identity. But that is not a standalone issue. It is framed by a larger political issue. Take South Africa or any African country. If you look at the census has two categories: races, tribes. You ask yourself, am I a race or a tribe? And the answer is, if you come from outside, you belong to a race. If you're from within, you belong to a tribe. races are considered civilized and have rights. The whites have the most, the Indians have slightly less, and so on. Tribes don't have political rights. When independence comes, sooner or later, there is a demand to turn this world upside down. The tribes must take charge. And the tribes must be sovereign. So, which tribes? Which tribes are indigenous? Now you're talking of a continent with a history of migration. Right? Which tribes? Which is the cutoff point? Right? Look at the American census. Ask yourself, when did the Hispanics get included in the census in America? They were not there. They became included very recently. Yeah, very recently. I think 70s or something. Anyway, very recently. So, identity, there are two kinds of identities. I'm now using your language. There is the identity of the oppressor and the identity of the oppressed. Both will mobilize around identities, but for very different reasons. And with unintended consequences. Well, you know, in India, right? Mandal Commission and the entire debate around it, right? What are the unintended consequences of identity-based mobilization and identity-based dispensation? And where will it get us unless we check it? Same debate in the US on affirmative action. Okay. How far? When does affirmative action stop equalizing? And when does it start building a new system of privilege? So there's no easy answer. There isn't. Anything you try, you take a risk, and you have to be willing to take the risk, because history is not going to stop. So you can't say, I'm opposed to affirmative. We cannot say, I'm opposed to affirmative action, but we can raise the question. What's our goal? Right. I'm not sure we can do away with identity politics so long as we have a state which identifies us in that way. That begins mid-19th century in India. I could go on, but I'm going to stop. You have to read Sir Henry Maine.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop, but just to last information, till 1964, the Aboriginal population in Australia was labeled as flora and fauna. And if you shot an Aboriginal, you got $500. And if you shot a kangaroo, you got $500. It was only till 1987 that the Aboriginal was then given the vote, and their children were then not removed, the lost generation that you have. Nazism is something that continues to exist across political thought and systems. And it's really an experiment, not quite an experiment, it's a thought that continues. I think all of us need to deal with it in whichever way we wish to, and continuously need to also battle and push back on it. Ladies and gentlemen, I think thank you all so much. To the end of the session, Mahmood Mamdani, just an incredibly brilliant mind, and what a writer and thinker. For all of you who've gathered here today, thank you so much. The Jaipur Literature Festival and JLF continues to be a platform for all kinds of thoughts. We ourselves don't identify with one or the other. We don't endorse one or the other. But we do believe that it is a place where we have all kinds of people coming to share their ideas. It is for you to take away what you wish, agree or to disagree, question or to hold them for what they stand for. And that's what we do. Thank you all so much for being here. And thank you to the Asia Society. And on behalf of all my colleagues, thank you all for coming. And of course, to our writers and to all our supporters. Thank you.